you ever stopped to think, really think, about how beliefs from, I don't know, thousands of years ago might still be shaping things?
Shaping how we see the world.
Yeah, exactly. How we see the world, how we see each other, even today.
Mm.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into something really fascinating. We're going to try and piece together some connections.
Connections between what, specifically?
Between ancient sun worship, how religious and political power developed, and some, well, surprising links to how we understand identity now.
And this is based on sources our listeners shared.
That's right. We're diving into a set of really thought-provoking materials provided by you.
It is pretty remarkable, isn't it, how these things that seem separate, ancient cosmology, religious ideas evolving, societal structures, how they're all tangled up.
Yeah, tangled, that's a good word for it.
It's like finding, a hidden blueprint under the surface of history.
Totally. So our plan today, our mission, if you like, is to trace that powerful sun symbolism in ancient cultures. And then consider this idea, this possibility of a widespread people of the sun kind of archetype.
And how that might have been downplayed.
Exactly. How dominant groups might have strategically maybe suppressed those ideas. Ultimately, we just want to offer a different lens, maybe a fresh perspective on these historical and contemporary ideas about identity and power.
Sounds like quite a journey. Where do we start?
Okay, right. Let's dive in. Let's go way, way back. Before Christianity, let's look at that deep respect ancient civilizations had for the sun.
Right. Across so many different places, the sun wasn't just, a big ball of fire. It was the ultimate symbol, divine power, the force giving life.
Like Ra in Egypt.
Exactly. Ra in Egypt, not just a god, but the creator sailing across the sky. Or think about Shamash in Mesopotamia.
Shamash, linked to justice, right?
Intrinsically linked.
Yeah.
Justice, truth, the actual laws people lived by. Then you've got Surya in India, a hugely important sun god in their foundational texts.
And the Incas.
Inti for the Inca, absolutely central to their entire worldview.
It's pretty striking, that consistency, this thread of just reverence. It wasn't only about warmth and light, was it? It was like the sun stood for these fundamental things: truth, cosmic order, life itself.
Yeah, it almost feels like a universal human thing, doesn't it? Looking up and seeing this celestial body as profoundly significant.
Definitely.
And that deep-seated solar reverence, it was sort of provided a basic symbolic language, a foundation.
A foundation for what came later.
Well, what's really interesting is how these powerful solar themes, light, power, life, they seem to almost prefigure some of the messianic narratives that popped up later.
How so?
The symbolic toolkit was already there, you could say, ready to be reinterpreted or adapted.
Which brings us neatly to that really intriguing idea.
Yeah.
The shift from sun, S-U-N, to sun, S-O-N.
The convergence.
Yeah, it feels like more than just a coincidence in English, right? Symbolically, linguistically. Can you unpack that a bit? How did that theological evolution happen in Christianity?
Well, the sources suggest it was a fascinating process of adaptation. Early Christianity, trying to spread its message, trying to connect.
Connect with what people already understood.
Exactly. It drew on familiar, powerful solar imagery. You see it visually, right, in the iconography.
Like halos.
Precisely. The halo, that glowing circle around holy figures' heads, it's a direct echo of the sun's rays, signifying divine light, illumination.
You see it a lot with Mary, too, don't you?
Very much so. And those sunburst patterns often shown around her, that just emphasizes the connection even more.
Okay.
And even things like the timing of key events, like the crucifixion, some argue they align with important points in the solar calendar, the solar cycle.
Wow. So it's almost like the immense authority and meaning already tied to the sun.
It was being sort of transferred, or at least borrowed.
Yeah, transferred or mapped onto this new central figure. And the fact that sun and sun sound the same in English.
While maybe accidental, linguistically speaking.
It certainly created a potent symbolic link in people's minds, right?
Yeah, absolutely, a powerful convergence. And it's around this time, within this shifting symbolic world, that our concept of race as a distinct way to categorize people starts to emerge.
Right, and it's so important to remember, like our sources stress, that racial classification, as we think of it now, is pretty recent.
Relatively speaking, yes. It's a social framework.
It's not some fundamental biological truth.
Definitely not. Modern genetics tells us we share the vast, vast majority of our DNA. There's often more genetic diversity within so-called racial groups than between them.
So categories like, Sub-Saharan African, European, East Asian, They're constructs.
Human constructs.
Yeah.
Useful, perhaps, for some things, bureaucracy or sociology maybe, but ultimately social creations. Those 8 general groups mentioned in the source material fall into this.
Okay.
Now let's try a thought experiment. Imagine, hypothetically, a sort of scale, representing how well different groups over many generations adapted to different levels of sun exposure.
Okay, like a tolerance scale.
Sort of. But this isn't about judging value, it's crucial to say that. It's just a way to visualize how a physical adaptation
Like skin pigmentation.
could have been symbolically interpreted in those early narratives.
Oh.
Maybe people who were more adapted to intense sun were seen symbolically in a certain way.
Okay, let's run with that hypothetical.
Yeah.
We have this ancient respect for the sun,
That's right.
deep reverence, and we have groups who, adapting over generations to strong sunlight, develop darker skin. Could that have led to a symbolic link? A cultural idea of being people of the sun?
That's exactly the intriguing possibility the sources explore. If the sun is divine, the source of life and truth,
Yeah.
then maybe those who seemed most resilient under its power, those with high tolerance for its intensity, perhaps they were seen as having a special connection to it.
The unique relationship.
It could have shown up in their origin stories, their spiritual practices, maybe a collective identity, feeling favored by or just deeply connected to the sun.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Because if that people of the sun idea existed, that sense of a special link to the ultimate power, it's not a massive leap to see how that could later connect to theological ideas, like being the people of the sun, inheriting that same kind of spiritual favor.
Exactly. The symbolic groundwork, you might say, could have already been there. But, and this is key, how that archetype was interpreted could go either way.
How do you mean?
Well, it could have been empowering for some communities, a source of pride, identity.
Okay.
But on the other hand, it could also have been deliberately pushed aside, suppressed, or reinterpreted by new ruling groups.
Groups wanting to build their own power.
Yes, perhaps under a different symbolic system, maybe specifically that sun-to-sun narrative we talked about.
Which leads us to a possibly uncomfortable but really important point. The suppression, even the erasure of these people of the sun stories. History shows us knowledge gets destroyed, right?
Oh, absolutely. Deliberately destroyed or just allowed to vanish. The Library of Alexandria's destruction is maybe the most famous example.
A catastrophic loss.
Huge loss. Who knows what diverse views on cosmology, religion, maybe even detailed accounts of solar cults and identities were lost there.
And closer to our time.
Look at the Spanish conquest in the Americas. They systematically burned indigenous codices.
They're history books, basically.
Their records of history, beliefs, identity, just wiped out, replaced by the conqueror's story. And you see similar patterns with the suppression of African oral traditions under colonialism.
Where indigenous knowledge was just dismissed.
Dismissed, demonized, actively suppressed in favor of European religious doctrines.
And religious re-education was a big part of that strategy, wasn't it?
A huge part. It wasn't just about changing beliefs on the surface. It was about fundamentally reshaping how people understood history, their own place in the world, their very identity. The church and the state often worked hand in hand on this, reshaping collective memory, establishing a new dominant narrative that backed up their authority.
And that probably involved squashing any people of the sun stories that didn't fit.
It seems very likely. Suppressing or reinterpreting anything that might challenge the rising sun-to-sun framework and the power structures that came with it. Control the stories, you control the understanding of power.
Okay, so we see this historical pattern of suppression. How does that connect, potentially, to divisions we see today? The sources mention modern echoes, things like religious identity, and nationalism.
Right. If you trace this historical arc, suppressing diverse spiritual narratives, including these potential people of the sun identities, it arguably contributed to the long-term dominance of certain theological and political structures.
And that dominance continues.
Well, you could argue that certain forms of modern nationalism, closely tied to specific religious identities, are a kind of legacy of this, where one particular religious framework gets linked to national identity.
Sometimes leading to exclusion.
Sometimes leading to the marginalization or exclusion of those who don't fit that mold, yeah.
It's like that dominant sun-to-sun narrative and the power structures built around it have had this long shadow.
A very long shadow. And our sources even dip a toe into that speculative area of epigenetics and cultural memory.
Ah, yes, the idea that trauma, that symbolic loss, might somehow leave a mark across generations.
It's a really provocative question, isn't it, about the lasting impact of historical trauma, of having your identity suppressed.
Is there actual evidence for inheriting specific memories?
Well, inheriting specific cultural narratives biologically is still very much up for debate and research. Highly speculative.
Okay.
But the prolonged experience of repression, the loss of heritage, could potentially lead to epigenetic changes, things related to stress responses, maybe inherited patterns of perception. It's complex.
Definitely complex.
But the idea that historical injustice might have subtle biological echoes, it's something people are exploring.
But it's not just a story of suppression, right? The sources also talk about reclaiming these lost narratives. For healing, for empowerment, what does that actually involve?
It's a really active, multifaceted process. You see communities reviving ancestral stories, traditions, through oral history, through art, recovering rituals, ceremonies, reconnecting with practices that hold deep cultural meaning. Indigenous education is vital, passing suppressed knowledge to younger generations.
So it's about taking back control of the story.
Essentially, yes. Rewriting their own histories from within their own cultural frameworks, achieving what the sources call narrative sovereignty.
Narrative sovereignty, I like that.
Yeah.
And what could the impact of that reclamation be, thinking about those power dynamics we discussed?
Potentially huge. If you think broadly about power, reclaiming lost narratives can reshape identity and power on a really fundamental level.
Wow.
By centering marginalized voices and histories, it can challenge those internalized feelings of inferiority that sometimes come with suppression. It questions the dominant institutional stories that have often propped up inequality, and ultimately it contributes to a more balanced, more truthful understanding of human history, globally.
But surely that kind of reclaiming meets resistance. Dominant systems aren't just going to step aside, are they?
Oh, absolutely not. The sources point this out too. Dominant systems have historically resisted and, continue to resist this kind of narrative resurgence.
Using what kinds of strategies?
Various things. Controlling the narrative is a big one. Censorship, bias education, cultural commodification, tokenizing or appropriating elements without real respect or understanding.
Right, I've seen that.
Using laws to suppress cultural expression. Psychological tactics creating shame or fear around reclaiming identities.
Divide and conquer.
That too. Setting marginalized groups against each other. And sometimes offering performative reforms, superficial changes that look good but don't actually shift the underlying power.
So it's an ongoing struggle then, a sort of push and pull over whose stories matter, whose interpretations win out.
Very much an ongoing process. But the potential for real healing, for a more equitable future, seems deeply connected to this act of remembering, of bringing silenced stories back.
Into the light, so to speak.
Exactly. And it's crucial to emphasize this reclamation isn't about swapping one form of supremacy for another.
Yeah.
It's about aiming for a more complete, more truthful picture of our shared human experience, recognizing the value, the wisdom in all cultural traditions.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just quickly recap the ground we've covered. We went from ancient sun reverence
To the sun-to-sun narrative shift,
explored the potential suppression of people of the sun identities.
and trace the lasting impact on identity, power, and the ongoing need for narrative reclamation.
And hopefully exploring these threads illuminated by our listeners' sources gives you, the listener, a richer sense of these complexities. Why valuing diverse stories is so vital.
Absolutely. What really stands out is the reminder that the stories we tell about the past deeply shape our present and future. So actively noticing whose stories have been pushed to the margins and working to bring them back into our collective awareness, that feels like a really important step towards something more just, more equitable.
So maybe as you go about your day-to-day, take a second. Consider whose stories are loud and clear in your own community, and whose might still be waiting for their turn. That power to shape the narrative. It's a significant force, isn't it?
It really is.
This has been The Deep Dive.